The federal election is now just a few days away, and it could be anyone's game. The outcome will likely be decided on turnout and strategic voting, says some pollsters. According to a recent Ledger poll, the Conservatives and Liberals are both tied with 32% of decided voters, meaning a majority government on either side looks out of the question. It's been an election unlike any other, taking place in a pandemic world. Door knocking has become more difficult, and volunteers are sometimes hard to come by. Large campaign rallies and events are out of the question, meaning voters have to do more research. COVID-19 will be the major issue voters will be reflecting on when they go to vote, with all parties releasing different platforms on how to recover from the pandemic. Justin Trudeau and the Liberals called an election during a fourth wave of the virus, but have reiterated many times it's still a safe time to campaign. Here's what Ottawa Centre Liberal candidate Yasir Naqvi had to say.
A lot has changed over the last year and a half because of the pandemic. All the assumptions that we had made in the last election in 2019 are no longer valid as a result of this pandemic. As we work on building a new economy, as we work on setting up the new normal, it is important that through a vehicle like the election, all political parties have an opportunity to present their vision to Canadians as to what the new normal looks like. How are we going to rebuild Canada after the pandemic is over, so that we have plans in place and a mandate by our elected representatives to work on those things. So that's why I think the election is really important.
The Liberals and New Democrats, on the other hand, say this is a senseless election, one that did not need to be called. While both parties might be campaigning on two totally different platforms, they can agree on one thing. This was a move the Liberals made in an effort to benefit themselves.
Look, I've been out at the doors, talking to Nepean residents, and the most common question I get is why would the Prime Minister call an election, in an upcoming fourth wave of COVID? So I think it's dangerous. I think the Prime Minister and many of his cabinet ministers are on record of saying that we shouldn't call a pandemic. I think he's looking at the tea leaves. He thinks the polling is in his favor. I think he's calling it for politically advantageous reasons. I don't think that he should, but that doesn't mean that we as Conservatives won't be ready. I think this is a critical election for us.
Oh, I definitely would have preferred that they wait. There's a lot of interactions that happen on campaigns, and people might not always see that, but Elections Canada has to do a lot of work setting up advanced polls and polling stations. All of the candidates' teams and volunteers are out trying to talk to as many voters as possible. So there's a lot of unnecessary interactions that will be happening now because an election has been called, and that increases the risk of community spread.
Advanced polls opened late last week and broke records for voter turnout. Elections Canada say close to 5.8 million Canadians voted during the 4 days, exceeding numbers seen in 2019 by 18%. With the fourth wave of the COVID-19 pandemic continuing to get worse, Elections Canada predicted a few million people would vote by mail-in ballot. However, that turned out to not be the case. Elections Canada predicted that roughly 2 to 3 million Canadians would vote by mail-in ballot this election. However, only slightly more than 1.2 million eligible voters opted for that option. It's still more than what was seen in 2019 when 500,000 Canadians voted by mail. But with so many different voting options provided in this election cycle, results in close-to-call ridings could take a few days to declare a winner.
Now, I know that Canadians are used to getting complete results on election night, but it will be different for this election. The count of regular ballots on ordinary polling day and advanced polls will be completed on the night of the election as usual. However, the count of mail-in ballots will start after Election Day once all the mail-in ballots that electors have dropped off at polling stations have been returned and integrity checks have been performed. If the volume of mail-in ballots is high, as we've seen in other jurisdictions during the pandemic, it will take longer for returning officers to count those ballots. In most locations, this should be done within 2 days, but in some in some districts, it could take as long as 5 days, depending on the volume and the distribution.
With just a few more sleeps until election night, the Conservatives and Liberals are tying neck and neck in the polls, and now campaigns are ramping up their attack ad strategies, primarily focusing on how the different parties would handle the COVID-19 pandemic. Charlie Sinach, UIN News, Ottawa.